So Unit 5 goes into voting and the four linkage institutions, which the four linkage institutions are political parties, campaigns, elections, and interest groups. So I'm going to talk about voting first and then talk about each of the individual linkage institutions. Although voting does work with linkage institutions, they are how we express our interest in the other four linkage institutions. They're just not technically one of the four. So let's talk about that first. Remember, the term franchise just means the right to vote. It is seen as an essential freedom for Americans as a way for us to express how we feel about what we want the government to do and how the current government's currently doing. And so this is seen as a way of polling the country's feelings on policies and politicians. Now, I did include the big voting constitutional amendments. Some of them I went over in Unit 1, but I went ahead and included them all in one place here as well. The 15th Amendment, which was one of the Civil War amendments, made it to where you could not stop someone voting because of their race. The 19th opened up the vote to women. The 17th opened up voting directly for senators instead of state legislators deciding who the senators would be. And the 24th outlaws poll tax. Now, those are the four I see most often on questions. And sometimes there's just straight up, like I saw a poll tax question on an old AP exam, like which amendment eliminated poll taxes. So these are ones you just kind of have to memorize. 23 and 26, although voting tied, I haven't seen like these specific amendment questions, so I wouldn't worry as much of those as the other four. But the 23rd Amendment did open up voting for residents of Washington, D.C., and the 26th Amendment lowered the voting age to 18 because as we are in Vietnam War and soldiers 18 to 20 are being drafted, but they can't even vote for the politicians who are the ones drafting them. So they passed a constitutional amendment so that anyone 18 and up can vote. A couple terms with voting that I wanted to make sure we went over. Political efficacy is a very important term, especially as we move forward in time. We're noticing less and less people are voting, and a lot of people are saying that's because they have low political efficacy. So political efficacy is how much you think your vote matters. So if you are in a strong red state, like in Texas, this is a very red state currently, and you know that like the odds are a Republican candidate's going to win our state, it can make people less willing to show up to vote because they're like, what's the point? We know who's going to win anyway. So that's what we mean by low political efficacy. They don't think their vote's going to make a difference because it's such a strong red or blue state. However, this also makes it difficult for us to calculate as state demographics change. If people don't think their vote matters and don't show up, we don't know when states will start to transition away from primarily red, primarily blue to the other or to a swing state. So it does make it difficult with less people voting to really see how political demographics are changing over time. As I said yesterday, older generations tend to vote at much larger numbers than younger generations. And in terms of turnout, the national elections have the largest turnout. At the top, presidents, then congressional elections, then state, and then local. I mean, we have local elections going on right now in Argyle, in Denton County, but those elections are over issues like, should the bond pass? Who should be on the school board? Who should be on city council? Which you have to research those people running for those positions in that bond package yourself. It's not like it's being advertised to you, like who is running for school board and what they believe in and what they want to do for the district. So local elections are not as in your face as we see large presidential elections. So they tend to have more people understanding what the party stands for, what the candidate stands for, and showing up to vote more often. This is something I've seen from Unit 5 probably the most often. And I will say the first one, perspective voting, I think is the trickiest because perspective can sound like the others, but the difference is perspective is talking about the future. So be very careful with perspective voting. If it talks about something about will or in the future, that is using your mode of voting for perspective voting. So that is, voting based on how you think a candidate will perform in the future or how a candidate will address your issues, which how a candidate will address your issues sounds a lot like rational choice, but you notice I said how they will address your issues. It's mentioning the future tense, and so it should be under perspective. So that's the trickiest part. Perspective, anything about the future, put under there. Under retrospective, I mean, it's the opposite. It looks back on the past performances of a politician to determine your vote. So I may look at the 4 years of Biden in office and decide if I think he did a good enough job to deserve my vote for another 4 years. So looking back on past performance. And since our presumed candidates are both presidents and ex-presidents, we can look at retrospective at both performances of presidents in this election, which is pretty rare. Straight ticket voting is voting along party lines. Like no matter who the candidate is, you will be voting all Republican or all Democrat. And then rational choice voting is taking it instead of on a party or candidate base, taking it on your own views on issues and deciding which candidate best represents your personal issues. So instead of being like I vote Republican, being like, well, I feel about this about economic issues, this about these social issues, which candidate best addressed how I feel about certain issues. So taking it on an issue, your own personal issue beliefs instead of candidates or political parties. Requirements to vote, very important because it is in the Constitution and it is in Article 1, which is the legislative branch of the Constitution. But in this section of the Constitution, it lays out that voting requirements will be set up by the states. So this is a power reserved to the states to determine time, place, and manner of elections, which is why we have discrepancies in things like voter registration. How long before an election can you register to vote? Some states it's 30 days. Some states it's 1 day. Some states you can register to vote right before you vote in the actual election. So that varies state by state, which can make it more or less difficult for you to be able to vote on election day. Same idea, but with voter ID laws. Some states require you have a photo government issued ID in order to be able to vote on election day. Some states require no ID. Some states require some form of ID, but it doesn't have to be picture based. So again, states have this power to decide this. So there are many discrepancies in the ease of voting come election day. One federal law that was passed by Congress in about the 1990s, the motor voter law, they did make it a law that when you go into the DMV in any state in the country, they have to offer you the option to register to vote. They have to have that as an easily accessible option. So while you're renewing your license or getting a license, if you're 18, you're given the option to register to vote. So that is one way the country has become more uniform. However, what they found with motor voter laws is although this did lead to many more people registering to vote, it didn't actually lead to larger turnouts on election day, because just because you're like, yes, I'll register to vote doesn't mean you're going to actually show up to vote. So I said the second part of this is about the 4 linkage institutions. What do I mean by linkage institutions? These are things in our American society that connect the people to the American government. So it is ways for the government to know our interests, ways for people to have a say and help draft legislation and lobby and put people into office to better connect the representative government more directly with the people. And I'm going to go over each of these individually, but we've got political parties, interest groups, the media, and elections. So let's start with political parties. Now in Unit 4, I went into ideology and the basic makeup of the parties in terms of what they want in terms of interference in economic and social issues. So I'm not going to do that here. I'm going to go over more the makeup of a political party and the function, and then how they work in campaigns, since I did ideology yesterday. So a political party, of course, their bottom line, their goal is to get candidates that represent their party's ideology into office, which the political party ideology is written out in their party official party platform. So this isn't just like one candidate, one politician's promises to a country. This is a written out, detailed explanation of what does the Democratic Party support and believe. And you can easily find these online to show what the political parties stand for. They then try and find candidates that best represent that platform, and then they focus on getting those candidates into office so their platform can then be rolled out in Congress and the presidency. Now, in terms of leadership of the political party, Political parties have a national chairperson who oversees the parties running. And underneath the national chairperson, they have committees that also help with things like organizing the national conventions they hold this summer to help finalize the picking of candidates for president, how they're going to help that candidate campaign over the last 6 months before the election. Definitely, they do a lot to pick a candidate and then help the candidate become the elected position. Oh, and there was one update I wanted to make in terms of how we've moved as a country throughout American history. Earlier in political parties, we were focused on the ideology of the party, and the candidate was just someone who represented the party. But in modern politics, what we've seen more often than the party is we as a people look at the candidate and the candidate's beliefs and what we think of the candidate themselves as a person instead of looking at the party. So we've become more candidate-centered than party-centered in more modern history. Third-party candidates in the US, which more of an answer to that is not very, there aren't very many third-party candidates in the US. And even if there are, and when they do pop up, they don't win national elections. We've never had a third-party candidate win the presidential election. And it's been ages since we've had a third-party candidate in Congress. However, it doesn't mean that third-party candidates are unimportant. We still see them as a vital way to let people express issues that they think that are important that the main two political parties are not addressing. So it brings to light issues that many people rally behind that the main two political parties are not addressing, like the Green Party, like the Tea Party, where we see candidates from them getting some traction nationwide, bringing to light that this issue is important, but not enough to give them a political office. And why they're not able to be successful in terms of national elections is because we have a winner-takes-all system. We have a winner-take-all system in the Electoral College and in voting for the House of Representatives, where in the Electoral College, they don't divide out electoral votes and give some to one candidate and some to the other. Whoever has the largest number of electoral votes in a state gets all of the electoral votes for that state, which makes it to where only the two established parties have a chance of taking a whole state. Like our last major third-party candidate, Ross Perot in the 90s, he in one of his elections had 19 million votes, but did not win a single electoral vote. So 19 million votes, he had a lot of the country supportive of him as a candidate, but the winner-take-all system meant he could not get electoral votes. And remember, electoral votes, not popular votes, are what determines who will be the president. Same, the districts for the House of Representatives are winner-take-all as well. Versus other countries that do have more successful multi-party systems, it is because they offer what's called proportional representation, where if a candidate wins 10% of the votes, they will get 10% of the seats in that country's government. So that way, even if you don't win the majority, you can still have enough support to give you a place in the national government. Although many multi-party countries still have two main ones, this does enable the country's legislative to have third-party candidates with a voice in the national level. Interest groups is the next linkage institution we're going to talk about. I already mentioned them in Unit 1 underneath pluralist democracy, but now we need to go a little bit more in depth in interest groups, which I have a very broad umbrella term for interest groups because there are so many interest groups under so many different topics, categories, and issues that make up the interest groups in our country. So they are any organization, a formal organization of people with a common interest, kind of exactly what it sounds like in the name. But they, by coming together and forming a group, are more able to influence public policy than just one individual writing to their congressman. So interest groups have been a successful way for people to express their issue and have an influence on what Congress passes. And the way that they do this is by lobbying. They, and a lot of lobbying happens in Washington, D.C., have experts on their topic go to D.C. and meet with politicians to try and convince politicians to take on their cause. Now, they can help politicians do this by, for example, drafting legislation. They could write up the bill that relates to their issue to give to the politician, and then all the politician has to do is put it on the floor of the House or the Senate. So they can, in fact, go as far as to write the legislation, taking that burden off the politicians' hands. And so that can then be, their expertise in exactly how they want their issue addressed brought to Congress. They also provide expertise for committees, like they can give testimony, they can have presentations for the committees in Congress to help Congress understand the issue more clearly by people who have a vested interest in the issue versus politicians who have to deal with all sorts of issues from varying ideas. These are people who only focus in on this issues. And then they can even send memos, send emails, go to informal dinners, but there is an ethical line with lobbyists. They are not allowed to directly give gifts to politicians to get their issue addressed. They can't bribe them, they can't give gifts, and that's strictly monitored because we don't want politicians writing legislation based on who bribed them with the most money. So even, if they're helping them by writing legislation and being experts in the field, they're not paying them off to do what the interest group wants. Oh, and then grassroots lobbying, instead of lobbying to politicians in Congress, this is kind of the majority, the numbers idea, where if you get enough people to protest, leaflet campaigns, send letters to their congressmen under one interest, that might also have a positive effect and have it go through government to have legislation. Because if the media gets wind of large-scale grassroots lobbying, then that will make politicians aware that that is an issue that many people are in support or are against. Mm-hmm. Types of interest groups. Now I have two different categories. So you can be like multi-issue and economic, single issue and economic, or multi-issue, non-economic, single issue, non-economic. So it's kind of two different groups within groups of interest groups. So multi-issue interest groups are exactly like they sound. They're where it covers a broad group of people and their different needs as those issues comes up. For example, the AARP deals with issues that come up for those who are elderly. Anyone who's elderly can be an AARP, and they have a wide variety of issues that the AARP deals with. So it's a large group representing multiple issues. Or NAACP would be another excellent example of a multi-issue interest group. Single issue interest groups, they're just focused on one specific topic. So like the NRA wants pro-gun legislation. So they're just one issue that they're united for instead of broad issues over people who qualify. Economic groups are interest groups that are formed for financial or business interests. So businesses form interest groups. They're a large amount of very powerful interest groups because they're well-funded, tied to major corporations. And their goal is economic, where they want legislation that will help their business. So whether it be to not regulate their business, so they have higher resource costs, whether it be to have legislation that helps their business, they will lobby politicians to try and ensure that their business is helped and not hurt by legislation passed through Congress. So we see this like with GM and environmental legislation. We see GM lobbyists trying to make sure environmental legislation will not hurt them as a business. Labor unions also fit under economic groups, but this is for the worker instead of the business, making sure the worker is fairly treated. And then non-economic groups are the ones tied to things outside of business and finance, which could be, like I said, the NRA, the Mothers Against Drunk Driving, the AARP, where they're not tied to financial interest when it comes to their interest group. Pros and cons of interest groups. Pros, it brings people together under a common issue. So it can unite diverse groups that have a common goal and bring to light to the government what the people are searching for from Congress and from legislation. But cons, the groups that tend to have the most financing tend to be the most successful. We see the groups that are run by major corporations. They can hire the best lobbyists. They can help campaign financially for the politician. They tend to be the ones that have their voices heard more often than the smaller, less funded interest groups. And then one more term, free rider. There are many people who receive benefits from interest groups who are not in the interest group. So for example, anyone over 55 that's not an AARP, they're receiving the benefits of everything AARP gets passed through Congress, but they're not active contributing members to AARP. With interest groups, I have to mention the Iron Triangle. Very important. I didn't see it in a lot of specific questions, but it is still pretty common and somewhere on the AP exam. This is how interconnected Congress, the bureaucracy, and interest groups are, where they are in a mutually beneficial relationship and also mutually dependent on one another. So for Congress provides financing for the bureaucracy. They have the power of the purse, so they are the ones who can give funding to the bureaucracy. So the bureaucracy is dependent on Congress for funding, and in return, they are the ones who execute legislation that Congress passes. So the bureaucracy is responsible for actually carrying out and implementing Congress's legislation, which Congress needs the bureaucracy to do this. Otherwise, how will it be rolled out to the country? In terms of Congress and interest groups, the interest groups can support politicians that get elected into Congress. Also, as I already mentioned, interest groups can draft legislation and are experts on the topic, so they can offer their expertise to Congress. And in return, Congress passes favorable policy to those interest groups. And then interest groups in the bureaucracy, they can be experts for a bureaucratic agency as well. Interest groups can be. They can also lobby bureaucrats like they lobby Congress. And in return, the bureaucracy passes favorable implementation of policy that helps the interest groups out. So it's all mutual, working together, interdependent. But one thing that takes away from the strength of the Iron Triangle, the strength of the interconnectedness of these three groups, are issue networks, which are people who come together for one short, specific issue, but once that legislation makes it onto the floor, then they disperse. Once that legislation goes through and their issue has been met, they're no longer united. So this could be groups with very different ideologies that agree on one thing, but once that one thing has been accomplished, they are no longer an official organization. So issue networks kind of take away from the power of interest groups since they're short-lived and only on one specific topic. Then we have the election process. So nomination, how to get the Democratic and Republican candidate. We're in this process right now, have been in it since January. We are currently in the primary process. Although at this point, we've had enough primaries that we know who the candidates will be when the national conventions pick them this summer, Joe Biden and Donald Trump. So we know the candidates, but they're not actually official. They're like the presumed candidates until the national convention, because originally national conventions are where they picked the candidates for the ticket. But now the primaries decided, and that ends up determining it before the national convention. Now, primaries are the process of states deciding which candidate they're going to support for each individual party. So you have like a Democratic primary in Texas and a Republican primary in Texas. Now, the process begins in January, and those first states that have primaries are the ones that are most watched. You don't hear much about the primaries anymore by this point, but those first states, which are Iowa and New Hampshire, are watched closely because remember the bandwagon effect. Whoever wins those is very likely to win the following primaries because people see that candidate as the most likely victor and they like to vote for the more popular candidate. Now, in terms of Types of primaries. We have open primaries, which Texas is an open primary state. So you can vote in either the Republican or the Democratic primary. You can vote in either, not both, but you do not have to be a registered member of the party to vote in it. So I am not a registered member of either party, so I could walk in March and vote in the Republican primary, or I could go and vote in the Democratic primary. So you can vote in either in an open primary. Versus a closed primary, you have to be a registered member of that party to vote in that primary. So I'd have to be a Republican registered member of the party to vote in Florida's Republican primary. Semi-closed, or they call it modified on this visual, depends on the state, but usually semi-closed means you can vote in either unless you are a registered member, and then you have to vote in the party that you're registered in. But then when we have to also talk about our caucuses, which are like a closed primary because only members of the party can vote in a caucus. But instead of you going into a voting booth and privately voting and not having to tell anyone who you voted for in a primary, a caucus is an open forum where members of the party meet, discuss the candidates, and then vote publicly on which candidate should be the lead of the Republican Party. So it's a public voting forum with discussion instead of a private individual in the voting booth. But then once they've gotten all of the primaries and caucuses across the country, they hold a national convention and they pick the candidate for each party that will run in the election in November. Then in the election in November, we decide who's president based on the Electoral College. Remember, this is an example of elite democracy because instead of the people voting directly on a president, we have electors who are the ultimate deciders on where the electoral vote's going to be, which electors do not have to put their electoral vote towards the popular candidate. In fact, is a term for electors who do not put their vote towards the popular candidate, and that is a faithless elector. They're not very common, and especially there's been laws passed in recent history that have made it almost impossible to be a faithless elector, but we still have that option of the elector can go against the popular vote, but most of the time they don't. And so the elector will see the popular vote and then cast their electoral vote towards that candidate. And then the state who has the majority of the electoral vote for one candidate, all of the electoral votes for that candidate will be counted. Total, there's 538 electoral votes, and it takes 270 to win. That is distributed by two. Each state gets 2 for having 2 senators, and then the number of congressional districts in a state determine how many other electoral votes that you have as well. If there is no majority in the electoral vote for one candidate, the House decides who the president's going to be. So if there's no majority, which has happened twice, 1800 and 1824, it then goes to the House of Representatives who get to pick the president from the top candidates, which in 1800, that was when it was Jefferson versus Burr, and Hamilton backed Jefferson, which resulted in Burr shooting Hamilton. And then in 1824, it happened again because we were divided into 4 people on the ticket and no one had a majority. And Henry Clay backed John Quincy Adams. And John Quincy Adams, who didn't have the popular vote, because he was backed by Henry Clay, he did end up getting the support of the House and won the election, even though Andrew Jackson had the popular vote, and that led to the division of a new political party, the Democratic Party. In terms of vice presidential candidate, if they don't have a majority of electoral votes, that goes to the Senate. So president goes to the House, vice president goes to the Senate. That one doesn't really happen or is very noticed because, usually on the ticket they run together. So they usually get the same number of electoral votes, but it did happen once under Van Buren's vice president. Campaign financing is the next part. It is super expensive to run a campaign. More expensive. It is getting more expensive every election cycle. Candidates and supporters of candidates are spending more and more money each election because visibility is seen as one of the primary ways to get a candidate elected. And so we need to talk about that. Where does money come from? And I'm actually going to talk about one thing first before I go into the types of political action committees and where money comes from. I need to talk about types of money, which there's 2 types of campaign donation money. There's hard money and soft money. Hard money is directly contributing to a candidate. So you are giving your donation to that candidate, which this is the more heavily watched and regulated type of money, because the fear of hard money donations is if the candidate's receiving money directly from a group or an individual, they may feel obligated to pass things and push policies that individual wants. So there's a fear with too much hard money donations that the president will feel this quid pro quo relationship, that they will have to act in favor of their largest donators. Soft money is not as regulated because instead it's indirect. It's indirect donation. So you're not donating, giving the money to the candidate, but you can fund your own advertising campaigns. You can do things to help the president get elected as long as you're not giving the money directly to the president himself or his campaign. So soft money is not seen as dangerous because if it's not going directly to the president, the fear of the president needing to, give back to his most donated supporters isn't as big of a threat. So with that, let's go back and talk about where money comes from. Individuals can donate. Politicians can fund their own campaign. Ross Perot spent a ton of his own wealth on funding his campaign. Political action committees, which I'm going to talk about in just a minute. Political parties help fund it. The candidate themselves, and then any kind of fundraising, like internet fundraising. They have fundraising drives. They have auctions, are all under this umbrella. But the largest group I want to talk about with campaign financing are political action committees. And there are 3 types of political action committees that fund elections. Connected ones, where you have to be a member of a certain group to be in a connected PAC. So you have to be a member of the interest group to be in that interest group's PAC. You have to be a member of that business to be in that business's PAC. And so it's selective to members of that group. So because of that, the total amount that is given through donations from a connected PAC is not limited. However, individual donations of the members of that group are limited. So the idea is if the individual is limited and it's only a select group of people within that group, that doesn't need to have a cap on the total donations, just a cap on individual donations. And this is hard money donations I'm talking about. Non-connected PACs, this is where they're not a part of any official group. They're coming together. Independently of an organization to support a candidate, which that is a lot more open-ended for people to be included in a non-connected PAC because there's no kind of stipulation of you don't have to be a member of anything. So because of that, they have strict donation amounts that are limited because so many more people can join it. The total amount donated is limited as well. And that's in hard money as well. But then super PACs are the ones who donate via soft money. They can be formed by anyone. And since it's all soft money contributions, it is not as heavily watched and regulated as the other 2, because again, it's seen as, well, you're not giving it directly to the candidate, so it doesn't need to be as monitored as connected and non-connected PACs who are giving it directly to a candidate, which that has become a very common way to support elections without the regulation of hard money stipulations. Laws passed. FECA, Federal Election Campaign Act. You don't need to know the difference between the 2, but you do need to know the overall what this act did. It was the first setting up of laws regulating campaign finance. As people were spending more money on elections, it became more of a necessity for the government to regulate campaign finance. They limited individuals and corporations and interest groups and PACs on how much they could donate in hard money. And they set up the FEC, which is a bureaucratic agency to oversee campaign finance, the Federal Election Commission, to make sure that FECA is being followed. They also, in 2002, Congress passed the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act because the issue of FECA is it didn't adjust for inflation. So hard money regulations had not been adjusted for like 30 years. So they made it to where it was easier to donate more hard money donations by adjusting it for inflation. But then it started regulating soft money donations in terms of you have to be more transparent with your soft money and limiting like what soft money is, which made it more difficult for soft money transactions. Furthermore, BICRA also passed laws to try and limit the success of soft money contributions through things like the stand by your ad provision, where politicians have to say, like, I endorse this ad, or by not allowing any kind of political advertisements within a certain timeline of elections. 60-day of general elections, 30-day of primaries. So this would stop, the bombardment of ads right before an election that soft money contributions were going to. Which comes up, and I'll actually go a little out of order really quick and do media last, because this is a great place to do our only Supreme Court case for this unit, which was Citizens United versus the FEC. The FEC is that bureaucratic agency overseeing elections. Citizens United is a business that created Hillary the movie, which was a movie that was highly critical of Hillary Clinton when she was running on the Democratic primary in 2008 against Barack Obama. They released this movie very close to the primary and wanted to advertise this movie and broadcast this movie as people are voting in the primaries, potentially against Hillary Clinton. But that violated the 30-day primary BICRA law. So Citizens United sued, saying, you have to let us broadcast this movie because this is our freedom of speech, our First Amendment protected right. The FEC was like, this violates a congressional law and you cannot release this and advertise this during this timeline. They went back and forth. The Supreme Court decided in favor of Citizens United, saying that that part of BICRA did violate free speech, meaning that you couldn't force someone to not advertise within a timeline of election, because that was freedom of speech. But the impact of this is they also kind of further defined why soft money wasn't seen as problematic as hard money, making soft money a lot less regulated than BICRA would have it, and became a primary source of campaign contributions, although again, not directly to the candidate, indirectly to the candidate. And that whole part of like no quid pro quo of soft money was the Supreme Court's argument to why it was okay for soft money donations not to be regulated like hard money donations. The last topic is the media, which is the last linkage institution, which I don't need to say a lot about this because a lot of this is kind of common sense in the world today. But I do want to remind you that is protected by the First Amendment freedom of the press. We'll talk about prior restraint and not limiting that in other units in the Supreme Court cases, but we've seen the Supreme Court citing in terms of freedom of the press many times because the media is seen as a government watchdog to make sure the government is disclosing important information to the people and disclosing it accurately. So, with the Pentagon Papers and the Vietnam War and Nixon, a lot of this Nixon tried to stop the presses from running this, but that was seen as a violation of freedom of the press, and it was seen as completely valid for the press to run these stories because they're supposed to be the government watchdog. Now, with this, we have some bureaucratic oversight of the media, the FCC, which regulates like appropriateness of electronic media, like TV shows, making sure they're not profane. Or we also have government funding towards some media outlets like PBS and NPR. But most media is private with the goal of making a profit. And media is changing because that goal of how to get the most people to watch news sources and media sources is changing as we are more and more determined by what we watch on social media. And so because of this, media has become a lot more concerned about you clicking on their site, you watching their video. And so timing has become essential. So media outlets care more about getting the information out there first than checking the validity of the information and making sure the information is accurate. So media bias is becoming more and more of a problem as we move into this modern age. And that is the end of Unit 5.